Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. As always, I hope you enjoy the journey. In this episode, we delve into the world of international politics, where the phrase foreign agent is being tossed around more than a hot potato at a picnic that nobody wanted to attend. And no, we're not talking about the James Bond kind of agents trying to infiltrate a high-stakes poker game. No, we're talking about Georgia's ruling party deciding to bring back the kind of legislation that makes civil rights activists sweat more than Putin in The Hague. Let's take a look at our report to find out more.
7 Georgian opposition parties issued a joint statement condemning the so-called foreign agents law. The day before, the ruling camp announced the resumption of work on the implementation of the controversial project. Opposition parties described the move as a betrayal of Georgia's European path and accused the government of a total departure from European values and principles. The ruling Georgian Dream said the contents of the bill's draft remained unchanged, but the term foreign agent was changed to organization acting in the interest of a foreign state. Work on the bill was halted due to public pressure a year ago. Tens of thousands of Georgians took to the streets of the Georgian capital Tbilisi and protested for 3 consecutive evenings and nights, claiming that the government was trying to lead the country towards authoritarianism. Police used tear gas, stun grenades and water cannons against the demonstrators, and dozens of people were arrested, but were later released. As the media noted at the time, the introduction of the law threatened to delay or even freeze activities aimed at Georgia's integration with the European Union. The draft law stipulates that NGOs with at least 20% of their funding coming from abroad would have to register with the Georgian Ministry of Justice as foreign agents. Opponents of the bill say it resembles a Russian law which the Kremlin uses to crack down on civil society and eliminate independent media.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Georgia, the country that was once on the fast track to joining the European Union, has decided to take a sharp turn into the "what the hell are they thinking" lane. They are reintroducing a Russia-style foreign agent law, which is essentially a love letter to authoritarianism, complete with a heart-shaped seal made of crushed civil liberties. If passed, this law would require foreign-funded NGOs and media to register as agents of foreign influence, subjecting them to the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for that one uncle at family gatherings who's a little too interested in conspiracy theories. Georgia was granted EU candidate status in December 2023, with the European Union presumably believing that Georgia was serious about improving conditions for civil society. This, however, has all the markings of a teenager promising to clean their room and then shoving everything under the bed at the first sign of an inspection. The timing is impeccable, coming just a day after Kyrgyzstan decided to hop onto the repression bandwagon with their own foreign representatives law. It's like Georgia saw Kyrgyzstan's move and said, "Hold my wine." Both countries are seemingly in a competition to see who can alienate their civil society faster, with Russia sitting in the audience nodding approvingly like a proud parent at a twisted talent show. And let's not forget, the European Union here seems to be caught in a bureaucratic version of The Good Place, where every decision ends up being the exact opposite of helpful. On the one hand, they criticize these laws, and on the other, they're proposing their own Transparency of Interest Representation Directive. Now, if the EU were a superhero, it would be Captain Hindsight, always ready with a stern warning after the fact. They have expressed concern over Georgia's backslide into authoritarian practices, but it's a bit like scolding a cat for knocking over a vase. The cat doesn't care, and you're still left with a mess. As Georgia keeps toying with criminalizing the promotion of same-sex relationships, mirroring Russia's draconian laws, one can't help but wonder if they're using the same playbook, possibly found in the "How to Alienate Everyone and Ruin Everything" section of a particularly depressing library. And now, here to shed more light on the issue at hand is our guest today, Grigor Ilukhidze, Director of the Foreign Policy Council. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thanks for inviting me.
So, what is your take on the situation that Georgia is facing nowadays? On the one hand, it really does, at least on the surface, wants to join the European Union, but for that you need standards. And now, the reintroduction of the bill that is often being referred to really as the Foreign Agents Law, in anything but name. Now, that seems to be a very poor timing indeed, and they have already tried that a year ago, then retracted, but now are coming back. Are there any substantive changes to the bill, or is it pretty much more of the same?
Let me start with the identification of the reason for taking this decision to reintroduce the draft law about foreign influence. As you have already mentioned, the government of Georgia promised in 2023 that the issue would be closed and never discussed again, but we see a completely different reality. There are two potential motives, and it is extremely important to analyze these motives. First, the ruling parties may be testing the readiness of Georgian society. Shortly speaking, how far can the government go? If they manage to adopt this law, it will fully demoralize the already demoralized, divided and weak opposition. It will be a signal of capitulation from the opposition and the third sector. However, frankly speaking, this version seems to fall into the category of low credibility. The second version is more realistic, and the second version is related to fear. After reopening discussion about this draft law, the Georgian government was officially and unofficially warned by the USA, EU, NATO, foreign relations committees of 13 European parliaments and ministries of foreign affairs of partner countries that this law will have a devastating effect on the country's European aspirations. There are risks of personal sanctions as well. But the ruling party stubbornly continues to follow this line. And I have the impression that they are afraid of something more dangerous to them than the above-mentioned warnings. I think that they are afraid of Russia. But this picture is still quite blurry and we see only fragments. Logically, they could reintroduce this draft law after the easy victory in the upcoming parliamentary elections. They had quite a comfortable advantage, but they woke up political process, increased the level of aggression in society and damaged their own image. And if there is a statement from Brussels that Georgia might lose visa liberalization or candidate status, people will come out and most likely storm the government administration because these are some kind of national achievements for Georgians. The ruling team perfectly understand that the chances of such scenario are still low and see all the weaknesses of the Georgian opposition. And as I often joke, that if the de facto chief of Georgian dream billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili one day decides to appoint a zebra from his personal zoo on the position of prime minister of Georgia, opposition will be completely impotent to oppose.
So we're seeing in the background images from protests against this legislation. These are archival pictures basically related to the first time that the government has tried to introduce this. Now, what you said is really interesting because you said that the government might be effectively afraid of Russia. And it seems like we have a pattern forming there, namely that there is this bizarre convergence between the legislation of the Russian Federation and Georgia. Now, aren't we supposed to be seeing a legislative convergence, but with the European Union, not with Russia? I mean, first we had the first attempt at the Foreign Agents Law. Later on, there was an anti-LGBTQI legislation that was introduced and passed by the Georgian parliament recently, and this has also raised some opposition there. And now we have the second attempt at, once again, restricting the freedom of speech, labeling individual entities as being foreign agents. Now, the label itself will have a detrimental effect and will also have a major impact on the way these organizations function. So would you say that despite the European aspirations, it is still the case that the government in Georgia cares more about what the Kremlin is going to say than what Brussels is going to say?
I have an impression that the Georgian government is flirting with Russia, not because of their pro-Russian character, but because of the vulnerability of Georgia. Unlike other countries, Georgia does not have a big brother. For example, in case of Azerbaijan, they have Turkey. In case of Moldova, they have Romania. They do not share the common border with Russia, fortunately for them. But in case of Georgia, the local political elite, especially the ruling team, sees how ineffective the West is in supporting Ukraine, and they do not trust them. That in the black scenario, if Russia decides to annex Georgia, someone will provide tangible assistance. Unfortunately, Georgia, from this point of view, is in a geopolitical, let's say, isolation. Georgia is quite far from the European Union and the NATO. Yes, Turkey is a neighbor, but still we do not have clear vision what will be Ankara's reaction in case of Kremlin's aggression. That's why I have an impression, and this is my personal opinion, that the ruling team is trying to send some, I would say, friendly signals to Russia that we are not just against you, we are oriented on the maintaining the peace, and they perceive that such kind of approach might work. But of course, it is very difficult to test. They also quite well understand that the Americans and the Europeans will refrain from taking dramatic steps like sanctioning the leadership of Georgia because it will dramatically increase Kremlin influences, and this is what the Kremlin is expecting. And everything depends on the reaction of the society.
Well, what if, you've mentioned dramatic steps, what if everything that Europe does is simply leaving Georgia in the waiting room? Now, this scenario potentially could be satisfactory to Moscow as well, because for as long as Georgia is in this political limbo, not going either way, they might be willing to accept this because they have their hands full with the invasion of Ukraine, obviously. So it's not like they could try and, do a rinse and repeat of 2008 all over again, at least not yet. But for Georgia, this is bad news because effectively it's like pretending we're moving towards the West, towards the European Union, but really not going anywhere because you have legislation like this or like the anti-LGBTQI. This stuff is not acceptable within the European legal system. So do you think that this could be the whole point, really, just stalling this indefinitely?
I absolutely I agree with you that this is not effective, but I'm trying to figure out the logic of the ruling team, which is very difficult because on April 2, they supported the declaration calling for the Hague Tribunal to prosecute Russia. And on the other day, with the other hand, they introduced this law, which was approved only by Dmitry Peskov, who is the Kremlin's press speaker. And that's why, if you ask me whether this approach is effective or not, I believe that it is not. But, well, actually, I think that it will bring, when we talk about the long perspective, only negative effects to Georgia. But once again, I underline that I'm trying to figure out the logic of the ruling party, which is right now very difficult to guess.
So what about the consequences? What are going to be, the details of this legislation? How different is it from the previous one? And also, how correct are we in comparing this piece of legislation with what happened on the Russian soil? Is it really the case that organizations working in Georgia would be facing the same amount of persecution? Let's call a spade a spade. I mean, they are being persecuted in Russia. Is it going to be the same thing, or is it just a diluted version of the same? What would you say about this?
Well, frankly speaking, I do not know quite well how the Russian mechanism looked at the beginning back in 2012 when Putin introduced this law to Russians. I remember that the primary evaluations were quite positive that it has nothing in common with the repressions, but we see how it's carried on and what is the reality right now in Russia. And we have the same fears in Georgia, because we understand that the Georgian democracy is not a strong democracy. It is quite vulnerable, and such kind of laws might give the government additional tool to discredit the non-governmental organizations and the third sector, and I would say that they are very strong. I mean, the strongest in the region. And of course, it defines all those organizations as the foreign, let's say the entities of foreign influence, those organizations who get more than 20% of their funding from abroad. And by the way, one of the biggest beneficiaries of, let's say, European donors and American donors is the Georgian government. And that's why they somehow try to find a solution in communication. According to their narrative, our mistake was only the weak communication with the youth and with the population, with the society, and that's why we did not pass this law. But right now the situation is different, that we managed to explain quite well to Georgians what it looks like, but I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of active citizens do not believe in it. The only problem right now is the opposition. I mean, the strong opposition would have been able to use the catastrophic mistakes that commit the ruling government in any other country. But unfortunately, in Georgia, we see the dead political process.
So the government is exploiting the opposition's weaknesses, while at the same time opening a Pandora's box of censorship once it begins. Unfortunately, this could only be getting worse before potentially it gets better under a different government, a more democratic one. Georgian was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that in order to fully protect his country's airspace, the Ukrainian army needs 25 Patriot air defense systems, each consisting of between 6 and 8 batteries. Currently, a large part of the territory of Ukraine is under constant threat of Russian shelling, which the Ukrainian troops are unable to intercept.
Ukraine's allies are well aware of Zelensky's hopes and received plans detailing the locations where the systems would be deployed. According to Zelensky, Patriot systems are not the only suitable solution for Ukraine, although there are very few alternatives with the same level of efficiency, especially considering the intensity of Russian shelling is currently quite high. The Ukrainian president noted that despite the so far impressive results of the efforts of the Ukrainian air defense, further improvements are still needed. While many Ukrainian energy facilities are protected by local air defenses, the systems are ineffective against certain weapons, like ballistic missiles.
Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko has signed a law that will allow imprisoned convicts to perform contractual service for the Belarusian army. Under the new rules, it will be possible to recruit persons under investigation, ones who were previously imprisoned, as well as prisoners incarcerated in penal colonies for military service.
The new law introduced wide-spanning changes to the existing regulations on military service and mobilization. Penalties for evading military service were increased from 2 to 3 years in prison. The law states that Lukashenko may decide to mobilize the prisoners if necessary to ensure the interests of national defense and security. In recent days, independent media have drawn attention to Lukashenko's ambiguous statements about ongoing conflicts. At the beginning of April, he said that Belarus was preparing for war, while also assuring that his country did not want to fight. Prison recruitment is hardly a new occurrence in Eastern dictatorships. During the invasion of Ukraine, the Wagner Group and the Russian Ministry of Defense recruited more than 150,000 Russian prisoners.
Turkey has introduced changes to its visa policy. A visa or a travel visa will now be mandatory for citizens of Tajikistan traveling to Turkey. Previously, Tajiks were allowed to enter Turkish territory without a visa and to stay there for up to 90 days.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Tajikistan claimed that Turkey had not previously informed Dushanbe about the decision through diplomatic channels. Turkey did not share the reasons for the changes, but most Russian media linked the decision to recent terrorist attacks in Russia and in Istanbul, in which citizens of Tajikistan are among the suspects. In response, Tajikistan will introduce a visa system for Turkish citizens attempting to cross the border. Turkey and Tajikistan established bilateral diplomatic relations in 1992.
The International Sea Shield 24 exercises hosted by Romania begin today in Constanta by the Black Sea. Soldiers from Romania and 12 other countries, including Poland, will participate in the war games, which are to last until the 21st of April.
According to the Romanian Ministry of Defense, more than 2,200 soldiers and 135 units of equipment will take part in the exercises. The games will also be held on the Danube River and its delta. The purpose of Sea Shield 24 is primarily to train operations such as combating illegal operations at sea and on rivers, maritime search and rescue, assistance to ships in distress, and protection of critical infrastructure. Sea Shield 2024 is the largest international exercise ever organized by the Romanian Navy.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.